I didn't know I was writing a confession until the night I realized my home had become a stage for other people's comfort. If this story needs a name to breathe, then let it be the one my heart whispered when the house fell quiet after everyone left, the seat they saved for silence. I'm a woman, 39, a nurse practitioner who has learned how to listen to a person's breathing even in a room full of machines. I live in a wind-nipped corner of Vermont where winters keep their promises and summers are shy, and I am the mother of a girl with watchful eyes and ink on her fingers, a girl whose first word for me was not the first word she ever learned. I promised her once, softly and foolishly, that in my family, no one would ever make her feel like a guest. I believed it the way you believe in spring when there is still snow on your boots. I believed it until the day a piece of thick paper with gold trim arrived and reminded me that ink can cut like glass. The invitation did not say her name. It said adults only 18 and over strictly enforced no exceptions. The words were polite in the way storm clouds politely gather over a picnic. I stood at the kitchen counter and read them twice while she solved a geometry problem at the table pencil tapping. When she looked up, she didn't ask about dress code or shoes. She asked if the rule meant she wasn't wanted. I said it was an age thing. My voice was steady, but my hands kept telling the truth. And then she asked if it was because she was adopted, the word landing on the tile between us like a dropped glass. I wanted to sweep it away. I wanted to say I would march right over and fix it. I wanted to unask the question for her. But the truth is, some questions are not questions. They are mirrors. Mine had been foggy for years and now it was clean. That rule was a door with a sign on it. I didn't try the handle. I simply turned around and chose the air that didn't smell like someone else's permission. I RSVP'd no, without a note, without a reason, without the apology my family kept waiting for in their group chat like a weather report that never came. My 17-year-old daughter was Ban. The sister getting married, the glittered one, the bride with a ring that could steer sunlight, had once smiled at a handmade card my daughter pressed into her palm. It was the kind of card that takes 2 hours and all the glue in the drawer, the kind that leaves sparkle in your hair and a joy buzz behind your eyes. Weeks later, I found the card under a fast food wrapper in her back seat, wrinkled in the way love should never be. What stunned me wasn't the carelessness. It was the neatness with which my daughter filed the moment away. She didn't wail, she didn't plead. She added it to a quiet cabinet where the labels read things I have learned about where I belong. I kept telling myself the cabinet was empty, that the shelves were only shadows, but the inventory kept growing, the Easter baskets with names for every cousin but hers. The way my mother, careful and smiling, called her Charlotte's girl, not Lily. The way the word niece refused to sit in my family's mouth. If love is a house, I was walking its hallways at night, touching closed doors and telling myself the rooms were still mine. I did not call my sister to argue about the rule. I did not call my mother to ask for the exception my child's face deserved. I did not explain adoption etiquette to a group chat. I clicked not attending, and then sat on the porch and watched the maple across the street hold its gold, as if it knew the wind would come. Everyone tells you to pick your battles as though a child's dignity is a skirmish. In the hospital, we do not ask if the bleeding is worth the gauze. We press the wound, and we keep breathing for the person until they can breathe for themselves. That night, I decided to breathe for my daughter, in the language my family understood, least refusal. My phone trembled with messages. My mother, who always called only when thunder gathered, wanted to know if I was really making the wedding about a teenager's feelings. A different kind of thunder rolled in the group thread. My other sister, the mediator, when it cost her nothing, told me not to punish the bride because it's just one night. In another bubble, the bride herself explained consistency like it was a virtue you can wear to a party. They were right that it was one night. They were wrong about what one night can do to a girl who has spent years measuring herself against doorways. The difference between being a +1 and being family is that one of them requires a proof of purchase. The difference between being invited and being wanted is the difference between a chair and a seat at the table. The house went quiet in the middle of December the way a stage goes quiet before a curtain lifts. For years, I had hosted Christmas with the exhausted generosity of a woman trying to convert indifference with roast beef and twinkle lights. I had ironed napkins as if smooth fabric could smooth voices. I had bought folding chairs and prayed they could hold the weight of something I could not name. That year, I bought nothing. No chairs, no wine, no strings of cheerful apology. When the text trickled in the casserole assignments, the polite assumptions, the casual knife of, if she's even going to be there this time, I did not respond. The absence of a yes can sound like rudeness. In our house, it sounded like oxygen. We made lasagna in pajamas while snow pressed its face against the window. We watched a terrible movie and laughed until midnight. We opened presents a day early because we could, and nothing broke. The ceiling didn't fall in. The world did not take attendance. I looked at my daughter's face lit by the television and realized my tradition had been to keep bleeding in a room where no one had the decency to bring a towel. There is a small mercy in winter, it makes the sky honest. After Christmas, the air had a clean edge. My daughter sat on the couch, with her blanket tucked under her chin, sketching the way she always does when words feel like strangers. I folded laundry the way I always do, when life asks me to feel something larger than my courage. She asked me without looking up if my family would have liked her more if she hadn't been adopted. The kindness a mother thinks she owes a child is to answer quickly, to plaster the crack with reassurance. I wanted to tell her the story of a future where people changed, where love was a miracle bread that multiplied once everyone learned their lesson. But my daughter was not asking for fairy tales. She was asking which doors in this house were real. So I told the truth. I could hold that some people are only good at loving reflections of themselves, and that even if she'd been born from my body, certain eyes would still look through her to find the person they recognize. She nodded and said something heavier than grief and lighter than rage, that she didn't think she wanted them to like her anymore. It wasn't rebellion, it was rescue. The quiet that followed was not a punishment. It was the sound of a boundary catching. I wish I could say the family felt the shift and rushed in with the shovels of apology, but apologies require a map. Instead, a message arrived in a voice trained to sound gentle, even when it delivered a blade. It suggested I was obsessed with my daughter, that I used her like a shield, that insisting on her dignity was overprotective. I thought of how many times I had smiled until my jaw hurt, how many holidays I had stretched myself thin, hoping the shape of my patience would turn into a bridge. I thought about the word obsessed and decided I could live with it. If obsession means making sure a girl learns the sound of her worth before the world teaches her the price of admission, then let me be a woman who rearranged her life around a promise. Let my devotion be the thing people whisper about when they run out of weather. I have walked hospital halls at 3 a.m. with the ghosts of strangers' stories riding in my chest. There's always a family member who stands too close to the door, listening for good news, and a family member who asks the same question 5 different ways because saying it once makes it true, and another who updates the group chat with bravery they do not possess in person. Watching my own family during these months felt like rounding on a ward where the condition had a simple name and a complicated cure. The name was exclusion. The cure was a choice someone didn't want to make. And so, I made it. I made it in the language my daughter would understand 30 years from now when she told her own story about the winter she learned that love can be soft and fierce at the same time. I made it in the way I held the door closed with both hands and let my arms tremble. The trembling did not mean I was wrong, it meant the door had weight. Outside, the river down the hill kept talking to itself in the dark. Nurses learned to measure time not in days, but in vitals, in the returning blush of skin after a transfusion, in the way a sleeping child finally sighs when the fever decides to loosen its grip. In my house, we learned to measure time in the spaces where the noise used to be. No more counting the minutes until someone's comment required translation. No more inventory of what should be forgiven before dessert. No more rehearsing the speech I'd give about how a mother's love does not come with disclaimers. Instead, we counted the gentle things, the way my husband, kind and steady, passed her the bowl first. The way our dog, aging and earnest, chose her feet over anybody else's. The way the draft under the door finally felt like winter instead of something colder I couldn't name. The invitation lived in the junk drawer with the cords no one knows, and every time I reached past it for a lighter or a roll of tape, I felt its expensive edges and thought about the cost of looking away. The wedding came and went. The photos bloomed online like white flowers that don't smell like anything. I did not scroll. I did not check the comments. I put the phone in a drawer and made hot chocolate like I was building something on the stove, with sugar and milk, and the kind of attention I had wasted on people who never learned my daughter's middle name. If this is a revenge story, the villain is the part of me that believed being gracious would be mistaken for belonging. If this is a family drama, the climax happens in slow motion as a woman discovers the cruelty of compliance and the sturdiness of no. If this is karma, then the lesson isn't what landed on them, it's what landed on me. There is a memory I return to because it is patient enough to teach me the same thing every time. The first time she called me Mom, we were in the car, sunlight slanting in like a secret. She said it like a question, and then again, like a name, and then she looked out the window as if the trees had helped her. I pulled into a parking lot and pretended I had to fix something in the trunk because I wanted to cry alone for a minute, not because I was sad, because a door had opened inside my chest and all the air in the world rushed in. The winter of the wedding, I remembered that door. I remembered that my job has never been to keep a guest list for gatherings where love is rationed. My job has been as will be to keep that door open to watch my child's lungs expand when she stands in a room that doesn't ask her to shrink to carry her through the first storms until she remembers she has her own umbrella and can walk home by herself. January thaw pretended at the edges of our street, the kind of false spring that tricks the gutters into singing. I kept a pot of soup on, and my phone face down, a new habit that felt like wearing heavy boots after years of walking barefoot over broken glass. My daughter kept her sketchbook out in the open like a newly claimed flag. At night, when the house had learned the new quiet, she brought me the drawings and told me the stories she never had before, the cafeteria lines where she sorted faces into kind and not kind. The teacher who kept saying brave when she meant visible. The boy who teased her once and then asked if she wanted to see the creek behind his grandma's house, and how she told him no because his apology wore a grin. I was not rescuing her. I was listening, cataloging the small resistances that make a life. If you ask me what revenge looked like then, I would say it looked like a girl sleeping through the night. When the mail came, there was a padded envelope with my mother's return address and a note on top that said, "Your ornaments." She wanted back the story how every year I host Christmas, how the boxes with ribbons arrive like an apology. I opened it on the counter with a knife. Inside were glass bulbs I had bought on sale myself, and a ziplock of hooks like bent paperclip bones. At the bottom was a metal cookie tin with geese and sweaters, the kind that rattles as if promise were something that could be stored with crackers. I almost put it back. The sound of my name on my mother's voice has always been the one thing I could never ignore, even when it arrived in paperwork. I popped the lid. Inside were folded papers and a ribbon gone stiff from age and the faint iron smell of something not quite forgiven. The first paper was a Christmas card from my grandmother written the year before she died, her cursive still standing tall and stubborn, for Lily who fits the missing piece we didn't know we had. The second was an envelope addressed to me and never mailed stamped, but unsealed the way some truths linger on a desk until they gather dust and restraint. It was a letter from my grandmother's friend, a woman we called Aunt May, though she wasn't anyone's aunt. She wrote that she had been sending savings bonds to my mother each June and December for Lily's schooling someday because she'd met my daughter once at a church picnic and watched her plant beans with deliberate hands. "You can tell when a child has decided to belong," she wrote. "She will make the ground remember her." I sat with the envelope for a long time, the afternoon sliding toward the hour when the sun throws a kind of mercy across the sink. Then I took the papers to my bedroom and closed the door, and I let grief come like tide cold, insistent, not asking permission. It is a terrible thing to realize that someone has curated your life, that the moments of generosity meant for your child were intercepted and sorted like junk mail. I thought of the birthdays when money was tight, and I kept a brave face the nights I took extra shifts and pretended I enjoyed the fluorescent lullaby. I thought of my mother's way of presenting herself as a patron of the idea of family, how she could make charity look like duty and duty like grace. I thought of my daughter who hates numbers, but would be good at budgets if budgets were stories, and how I used to tell her we would figure out college when it was time. I had said it like a promise. It turns out someone else had said it first in ink and bonds and a faith in the future my mother had folded into a tin and put under geese and sweaters. Here is a thing I know from medicine: documents have pulses. You learn to take them. You learn where to press. I took the envelope to the bank on my day off. The teller was a woman with an easy ponytail and eyes that knew when not to ask questions. I explained that I was cleaning out old paperwork and wanted to check whether certain bonds had been redeemed. She asked for the numbers. I gave her what the letter listed. She clicked keys lightly as if careful not to hurt them. On her screen, the answers were dates. The bonds had been cashed out over a period of 3 years, starting the summer my daughter turned 12. I remember that summer because it was the year my mother bought a beach rental for a week and made everyone stand in front of a rented house like it belonged to us. My daughter had found a dead crab and buried it with a popsicle stick cross and a whole story. My mother had worn white and looked into the camera like she was willing the ocean to applaud. I thanked the teller. I did not cry. The thing about answers is that they leave your body only after you have walked them home. In the parking lot, I sat with the car off the kind of stillness where you can hear your own pulse. The temptation was to drive straight to my mother's house and pour the numbers on her table like marbles and demand she sweep every lie into a pile and name it. But another thing I know from hospital nights is that clarity breeds its own metabolism. If you act too soon, you only feed the part of the story that thrives on your reaction. So I went to the copy shop and made 3 copies of each paper, filed them in folders with Lily's name on the tab, and put them in 3 different places: my home safe, my office drawer, and a friend's locked file cabinet. Precaution looks like paranoia to people who have never had to prove they were telling the truth inside a room where truth was unwelcome. To me, it looks like oxygen tanks beside a bed. Maybe you won't need them, but when you do, you don't have the luxury of wishing you were ready. The next day at work, the hospital smelled like lemon cleaner and sorrow. Something in me calmed under the rhythm of the floor. A mother came in with a feverish toddler, and I ran my hands the way you do when you are trying to convince the world that 10 fingers can be a remedy. The world refused to be convinced. We admitted the child. As I filled out the chart, I realized I was writing the word guardian with a reverence I hadn't given it before. Language is a corridor. Sometimes you don't know which door opens until you touch the handle. The door that opened said this: I was not going to let my daughter pay for other people's definitions of family. The text came the next evening. It was a screenshot from my cousin, a decent man who has always apologized to me with casserole, and in it was the family group chat, with my name threaded through jokes like a seam no one wanted to admire. There was a line from the bride about rules being rules, and a line from my mother about teaching kids their place, and then a stranger's laugh reaction, which told me the thread had grown to include plus ones and in-laws, and whoever else needed the spectacle. At the bottom was a photo from the wedding of a place card with the words, "Reserved Family," in looping script. The table behind it was full. The chairs were warm. The caption from a cousin who loved to dare said, "Look, they saved you a seat." I stared at the photo until the letters broke apart into meaningless curls. The part of me that could still be surprised asked a question I'll never answer. How do people make furniture into knives? I didn't respond to the screenshot. I put my phone down and made tea and stood by the window like I could stitch the dark closed with my stare. Then I called my husband into the kitchen and showed him the tin, the letter, the photocopies, the bank-drawn dates like stones leading through a shallow river. He listened without interruption, his brow doing the work his words spared me. When I finished, he asked what I wanted to do. This is a dangerous gift, this kind of question. It opens a field and dares you to run. I told him I wanted us to act like people who understood our rights without forgetting our dignity. He smiled a little and said, "So, like you. We made a plan. Not the kind of plan that knocks on doors at midnight. The kind that waits for a door to open on its own, and then steps in carrying nothing but truth in a folder and the decision not to back away." The door opened at the end of January at a birthday dinner for my father in a restaurant that served its wine like a performance. My mother had chosen the place for its fireplaces and its photographs of famous people who had eaten soup there. My father likes pot roast and quiet. He wore the sweater I bought him 3 Christmases ago. He looked tired in the way men look tired when they have stopped convincing themselves the noise is worth it. We took our seats. The long table held our family like a museum holds artifacts labeled polished, mostly missing their stories. My daughter sat between my husband and me, her back straight, the carefulness behind her smile like a held glass of water. The bride arrived late in a white coat that believed itself. She kissed my cheek, as if our skin had agreed on any of this. My mother gave the toast, the kind that turns a life into a list of things someone else accomplished. There was applause. There always is when people clap for what's expected. When the roast arrived, I placed the tin on the table the way a person places a loaf of bread, casual, necessary, without drama. "I brought you something," I said to my mother, and because a part of me, small but living, still believed in ceremony, I spoke low and steady. "It belongs to Lily." The bride looked down, expecting glitter. My mother frowned the way you do when the story tries to change key. I opened the lid and took out the letter and the card and a copy of the list of bonds with redemption dates. I did not lift my chin. I kept it all level with the meat and the salt and the butter, because that's where truth lives when it is hungry. "What is this?" she asked, her voice already choosing its alibi. "It's history," I said, "and instructions." "For what?" Her laugh was the kind you use when you want witnesses to side with your version of surprise. "For returning what wasn't yours," I said. "For acknowledging what has always been." The table went quieter than restaurants know how to be. Somewhere behind us, a server dropped a fork and recovered the sound with a joke. My father's hands were in his lap, knuckles pale. The bride said something about misunderstanding, and I told her we could take our misunderstanding to the bank, to the clerk who had stamped those dates like a heartbeat. My mother reached for the letter, and I let her hold it. It is a complicated thing watching a person read their own undoing. Her mouth moved. Her eyes did what eyes do when they realize a secret has grown teeth. If you are waiting for a scene, the cry, the apology that swims across a table, the sudden montage of regret, you may be new to how certain scripts end. There was no confession. There was only a rearrangement of silverware, and a sigh that tried to be a storm, and the brittle music of someone insisting she had intended to tell me when the time was right. When is the time right to admit you have been stealing a future from a child who learned to call me mother under a slant of afternoon sun? I didn't ask her. I reached for my water, and I kept my voice in the register that never lies. "We'll give you a week," I said. "Then we'll take care of it ourselves." I did not mention the meeting I'd already scheduled with a lawyer who knew about guardianship and trusts, and words that could be braided into respect. I did not mention the way my daughter's hand had found mine under the table and held it like she was anchoring 2 boats. Later in the car, snowflakes banged gently against the windshield. My daughter stared straight ahead and said I didn't know we could do that. I asked what she meant. "Make them look," she said. "Without yelling. Make them look and keep our faces." I told her it's a kind of medicine I had to learn, the antidote to rooms that taught me that only loud women are heard. She nodded, a small sovereign motion. We drove home through a town that had gone to sleep on itself and didn't ask us for anything. There's a myth that boundaries are walls. Maybe sometimes they are. But that night, ours felt like a door with our names on it, the hinge well-oiled, the latch easy to find. Inside, the dog lifted his head and thumped his tail, and the house made the sound a house makes when its people arrive, and it can stop pretending to be a thing that only holds their shadows. I tucked the extra copies away. I made cocoa. We said nothing for a long time, and it was everything we needed to say. The week we gave my mother was a measured thing, 7 squares on a calendar that held their breath. I set reminders on my phone not because I planned to chase her, but because naming time is a way to keep from drowning in it. Lily started a new sketch. She drew a girl standing in a river water at her knees, palms open to the current. When I asked what she would title it, she said she didn't know yet. There is a grace in admitting you don't know the end of your own painting. I went to work and charted vitals and watched the gray sky try on different faces through the narrow window near the break room. My supervisor asked if I was taking enough time for myself, and I said I was learning to sit down without asking permission. She laughed like it was a joke, and I let it be one for her. On Tuesday, the lawyer's office smelled like pencil shavings and old books. Ms. Harper had the kind of calm I associate with people who have learned not to perform their power. She listened as I unfolded the story, not flinching at the pettiness that had grown teeth and the money that had turned into something you could trip over. She kept asking me to pause, not because she was lost, but because she was mapping. I laid out the papers, like bread on her desk. Aunt May's letter, my grandmother's card, the list of bond numbers, the bank's stamped dates that lined up too neatly with wedding deposits, and the kind of party my sister had thrown for herself 3 summers ago, with lanterns in the trees and a fireplace brought in for effect. Ms. Harper tapped a pencil gently, a metronome for restraint. She said there were 2 lanes here, the lane of moral clarity and the lane of legal consequence, and we would drive both without swerving. She explained how we could file a demand letter, how we could ask for full accounting, how we could trace the bonds and their redemption into whatever accounts had bloomed from them, how we could ask a court to compel restitution into a dedicated education fund under my guardianship for Lily. She spoke of good faith and breach of fiduciary duty, and words that had never met my kitchen table. When she asked if there was anything else, I hesitated in the way you do when you suspect the ground under your feet is deeper than you want it to be. There was a key taped to the back of Aunt May's letter. I had found it when I ran my finger over the paper too many times, feeling for something that wasn't there until it was. It was small and brass with a tag that said cedar in Aunt May's spidery hand. I told Miss Harper about the cedar chest in my parents' attic, the one that had always been just furniture to me, a thing you dust because it looks like it remembers better days. Miss Harper's eyes warmed the way a stove does when you pass your hand over it. She asked if I still had access to the house. I said yes, technically, because my father never changed my code, and a code is not the same thing as an invitation. On Wednesday after work, I drove over. The sky had the shy blue of late winter, and the yard was a frozen idea of summer. I parked on the street and walked up the driveway with the ease of an old choreography my feet hadn't forgotten. Inside the house carried its usual perfumes, lemon polish, something floral my mother had believed made a home pretend at itself, the faint metallic undernote of old radiators. I told myself I was retrieving my high school yearbooks, a lie so small it barely deserved the name. I went upstairs, opened the attic door, and felt the old wooden steps complain under my weight. The cedar chest waited near the back wall, under a sloping roof, and the single bulb that always made this room look like it was telling a ghost story. My hands shook when I slid the key into the lock, not from fear of discovery, but from the way grief makes your body remember what it was like to be someone who didn't know better. The lid sighed. Inside lay the careful hoarding of a life-wedding lace wrapped in tissue, a string of pearls that had belonged to my grandmother, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Beneath these, an accordion folder labeled Charity in my mother's tidy script. The folder held copies of thank you notes, church bulletins, tax receipts, programs with names printed in gold. Tucked at the back, where a lazier hand might have missed them, were bond stubs and photocopies of the very notes from Aunt May I already knew, except here my mother had underlined for Lily's schooling someday, and written in the margin, "We'll decide when she proves herself." The words ignited something that didn't feel like rage so much as a flare dropped down the well of my own restraint. There were also bank slips indicating transfers into an account with the bride's initials followed by the word events, and in another paper clipped to a handwritten budget a line item that read, "Caterer deposit use June bond." Proof is not a drumbeat. It is a quiet click. There were so many clicks that the room began to sound like a lock opening from the inside. I didn't take anything I didn't need. I took photographs careful and clear, setting each paper back exactly as I found it. I closed the chest and pressed my palm against the lid like it was a sleeping animal. As I turned to leave, I noticed a shoebox tucked behind a stack of winter blankets I recognized from my childhood, the tartan we weren't allowed to put our feet on the crocheted throw my grandmother had made. The box held blank invitations and samples of place cards, the swirls of font like vines. Under these was a printed email chain. I tell this part because there are always people who will ask, "Are you sure the chain had subject lines about appearance and cohesion, and settled on adults-only policy, as if the word policy could launder intent?" I read the one that mattered, my mother reassuring my sister that excluding the girl reduces questions in the photos. The girl. Questions in the photos. The part of me that loves language felt the floor tilt. Not because I didn't know, because the sentence had finally said itself to my face. I left the house in a kind of gentle hurry that looked like calm if you were watching from the street. In the car, I set the phone to "Do Not Disturb" and drove straight to Ms. Harper's office, arriving just before closing. She met me in the hallway with a cardigan on and a face that said she was already preparing to stay late. We laid the new evidence out on the table, my photographs, and the words that didn't want to be misunderstood anymore. Ms. Harper nodded the slow way you nod when a story you suspected has been brave enough to present its bones. She said we had more than enough for the demand letter. She said we could attach exhibits. She said if cooperation failed, a complaint was an option, and if the sums were significant, even a police report could become a conversation with a district attorney who had time for words like conversion and fraud. On Thursday, my mother called and left a message that began with, "This is not what you think," and ended with, "You're making trouble where there isn't any." Trouble is a strange word when one side uses it to describe consequences. I listened once and saved it. My father sent a text that said he was sorry about the way everything was getting out of hand, and asked if we could sit down as a family, as if the word family were not the very instrument a hand had been holding like a hammer. I wrote back that I loved him, and that I would speak to him alone if he wanted. He didn't reply. I recognize in him a man who has traded comfort for peace for so long, he can't tell they are different. On Friday, the demand letter went out on Ms. Harper's letterhead, professional and precise, giving my mother 7 additional days to provide full accounting and return funds to an account designated for Lily's education, with a warning that failure would result in filing. The letter cited dates, amounts, copies of correspondence, and collateral written evidence indicating intent to deprive the beneficiary. The word beneficiary felt both formal and holy, like it was trying to resurrect the prayer someone else had buried. The weekend arrived with a snowstorm that looked like an apology. We stayed in and cooked pancakes and watched the dog try to catch flakes with his dignified old man face. Lily painted the river girl into a diptych. In the second canvas, the water had receded and the girl's hands were full of smooth stones. She said she thought of titling it Inventory. I asked what the stones were. She said they were the promises we kept, small and heavy and good to hold. That night, after she went to bed, I opened my laptop and pulled up the family photographs I usually avoid. Not to count who stood where, to find my grandmother's face. In picture after picture, she looked like a woman who understood the cost of a joke no one else found funny. In one, she had her arm around Lily at that church picnic, both of them looking at the ground where they'd planted those beans. I pressed my fingers to the screen. I told her silently that I had found the trail she left. On Sunday, the bride sent an email that tried to style itself as a peace offering. She wrote of misunderstandings and the stress of planning and how she felt targeted over minor bookkeeping choices. She said she was willing to gift a sum to Lily for college if I agreed to close this chapter privately. I stared at the word gift until it lost its shape. I thought of all the times my daughter had tried to be small enough to fit the chair they saved for her. I thought of the picture of the place card that said family, and the empty chair that had never truly been empty, only reserved for silence. I forwarded the email to Ms. Harper without comment. She wrote back that she'd handle the reply. In the space where anger could have built a palace, I made soup. I folded laundry. I sat on the floor of my daughter's room and asked her if she wanted to look at colleges in places where the winter wasn't quite so proud. She smiled and said she wanted trees, not palm trees, just trees that look like they mean it. When Monday came, I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't victory. It was the absence of pretending. I walked to work through air that smelled like ice and smoke and a hint of bakery. In the pediatric wing, a girl with a chipped tooth asked if my badge meant I was in charge. I told her it meant I knew how to find people who were. She seemed satisfied, which felt like a blessing. At lunch, I drafted a letter to my father that did not indict him but did not spare him either. I told him what I had found. I told him what I would do. I told him he was welcome in our house any time he wanted to arrive without a lie in his pocket. I signed it with my name like it belonged to me. The week ended where it had begun in our kitchen, a light on over the sink, the sound of the dog rearranging himself to get comfortable at our feet. My husband poured tea and handed me a mug with both hands, as if the transfer of small heat could teach the room how to be warmer. Lily brought her diptych into the kitchen and leaned it against the wall. We stood together, the three of us, looking at a girl standing in a river, and then standing on a riverbed, hands full of stones, that glowed like answers you don't have to defend. I didn't know the name of the painting, and I didn't need to. Some things you name later when the rest of the story has told you the right words. The letter to my father left the house in the pocket of my coat and returned in the tremor of his voice 2 days later. He called early before coffee had made its steady argument inside me. His hello carried gravel. He asked if he could come by without her. I said yes. When I hung up, Lily was at the table with her sketchbook and a bowl of cereal she was pretending to eat. "Do you want me here?" she asked. I told her she didn't owe anyone her presence, but that I wanted her to do whatever made her feel most like herself. She nodded and went back to her lines, the page already full of small boats, whose sails looked like they knew which wind to refuse. My father arrived in the sweater I had knitted him the winter I still believed fixing the world was a matter of learning a new stitch. He stood just inside the threshold, the way men stand inside hospitals, ready to back out if the air says hush. I gestured him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the old one with grooves from science projects and a scorch mark from a birthday candle that burned too low. He looked at Lily and said her name like he was returning something he'd found on the street and hoped he'd recognized correctly. She said hello, then took her bowl and retreated to her room with the soft dignity of a cat. He waited until her door clicked before he started. He said he hadn't known about the bonds until a year after they began to disappear, that he'd signed a paper because your mother said it was for household consolidation. He said he didn't read it. He said he didn't know how to admit he didn't read it, because she starts sentences with "of course, you know," and he has spent his life keeping up with men who don't apologize for being slow. He told me about the afternoon he'd found one of Aunt May's notes on the desk, the line for Lily's schooling someday underlined in my mother's pen, and how he'd asked what that meant. And she'd said, "We'll handle it when she earns it." He said he had almost said something then, but the dog had been sick, and the plumber had arrived, and then the day had poured itself into the next day, the way soup covers a bowl, and the weeks became a season, and the season became the thing you call the way things are. I listened with my hands wrapped around a mug like it was an anchor. It is hard to sit with a man you love and understand the size of his silence. He did not ask me to look away from what he had not done. He asked if he could help fix it now. It was an old prayer and a new sentence. I told him there were steps he could take that belonged to him and not to my mother. He could go to the bank and add his signature to whatever accounts were in both their names. He could insist on access to statements. He could ask the lawyer, Ms. Harper, to copy him on correspondence. He could answer with facts when someone else offered him a lie already dressed for dinner. He nodded like a student who had come to office hours not to pass a test, but to learn what language knowledge speaks. He asked if he could give money toward the education fund today. I told him yes, but that it would go into the account in Lily's name we were opening with Ms. Harper's help. He nodded again as if grateful to be given a door with a handle he could see. That afternoon we met Ms. Harper at a credit union that still believes in the ceremony of a person's name. The bank manager led us to a small glass office and closed the door with a click that sounded like something respectful. We opened an account titled in a way that made Lily's future feel almost sturdy. Lily, last name, Education Trust. Ms. Harper arranged the papers like a careful magician who never hides the trick. My father wrote a check and slid it across to the manager with hands that have split wood and turned pages and let go when they should have held on. He didn't say he was sorry. He said he was late. It was better. When we left, the sky had built itself into a blue you could lean on, and my father hugged Lily in the parking lot with both arms, as if he'd remembered that you cannot half hold a person and expect them to stay. The seventh day of our letter ran out like a wick. My mother did not call. The bride sent a text with a link to a fundraiser for her honeymoon labeled, "Help us make memories," as if memory were something you could purchase the way you buy peonies out of season. I put my phone on the counter and looked at the clock as it stepped into evening. Ms. Harper filed the complaint the next morning, a stack of documents that spoke in clean, unflinching sentences. It asked the court for an accounting for restitution for the creation of the trust we'd already started, for the acknowledgement that the bonds were intended for Lily and not for a party where lanterns moonlighted as conscience. It attached the photographs, the email chain with questions in the photos. The bank states the margin note that had underlined for Lily's schooling someday, and then dared to add, "We'll decide when she proves herself." The hearing got scheduled for a Friday in late February. The courthouse, a building that wears its age, the way a face wears the story of where it's been. I took the day off. Lily asked if she needed to come. I told her no, but that she could if she wanted to see how rooms can be asked to behave. She said she wanted to draw the inside of justice. My husband squeezed my shoulder and whispered that he'd sit on whatever bench didn't creak. We dressed like ourselves, which is to say, we wore clothes that don't apologize for our bodies. The morning tasted like dental offices and mint gum. In the hallway outside the courtroom, my mother stood in a coat the color of money and a scarf that pretended at softness. The bride hovered to her left like a punctuation mark that can't decide if it's a comma or a period. My father stood a few steps away, hands folded, quiet eyes on the floor tile pattern, like he was counting how many squares it takes to cross a room without drowning. Inside, the judge had a face that looked like it knew how to separate weather from climate. He listened the way good people do, with his mouth closed and his eyes steady. Ms. Harper spoke in the voice of a map that has learned which roads to name. She laid out the timeline, the bonds, the letters, the cedar chest, the email chain. She placed each exhibit in front of the court with an economy that felt like mercy. My mother's attorney performed indignation in a suit that fit him too well. He waved at misunderstandings and family arrangements and agreements that were verbal but heartfelt. And when he reached for adults-only policy as a neutral fact, Ms. Harper slid the email about reducing questions in the photos across the table like a lit match. The judge read it for a long time. You could hear someone cough 3 rows back, and the whir of the air vent trying to make the room remember how to breathe. He asked my mother's attorney if there was any evidence the bonds had been intended for general family use. The attorney said something about discretion. The judge asked if there was any document showing that Aunt May had changed her mind. There was not. He asked my mother to approach. The attorney looked at her, measuring the risk. She came chin high. The judge asked if the handwriting in the margin was hers. She said yes, but began "I only," and stopped when he raised a hand. He asked if the deposits from the bonds corresponded with payments to vendors for the wedding labeled under the bride's initials. She said she couldn't be expected to recall finances from so long ago. Ms. Harper mentioned the dates were 18 to 30 months in the past. The judge waited. Silence has a sound when it is waiting for truth to try its courage. When my turn came, Ms. Harper asked if I wanted to speak. I did not want to make a speech. I wanted to place a sentence in the room and let it find its own weight. I told the judge this was not about punishing people who needed to perform a party. It was about making sure the promise written in Aunt May's hand could stand up and walk where it was meant to. I told him Lily's name like it was an address. I did not cry. I saved my tears for a desk in a quiet room where paper doesn't mind being baptized. He nodded and made a note. He ruled that day. He called it clear intent and misappropriation and breach of duty, and words I will never forget, because they were not dressed as favors. They were declarations. He ordered a full accounting within 30 days. He ordered restitution of the amounts cashed, plus interest to be deposited into Lily's education trust. He named me trustee. He noted the email regarding questions in the photos as evidence of bias, and while he said he could not rule on manners, he could acknowledge what the room already knew, that some people use policy as a curtain. He recommended gently, and with the authority of a person who has watched many families try to build with broken tools, that we consider mediation for the rest. Then he looked at Lily, who had been drawing in the back row, and had stood up with a grace you learn when you spend years measuring a doorway before you walk through it. He told her the world is not always fair, but sometimes it can be made to remember. Outside, the cold slapped our cheeks like a revival. The bride brushed past without looking at me. My mother held herself like a statue that resents the pigeons. My father came to us and put his hand on Lily's shoulder without hesitation and asked if she wanted pancakes. She nodded. In the diner, the syrup was generous, and the coffee tasted like it had memorized mornings. Lily slid her sketchbook across the table. She had drawn the judge's pen mid-air the moment before ink makes a mark and changes a page. She titled it Before. When I asked why, she said, "Because it's the second you can still wreck it or redeem it." I told her that's what adults call choice, and her smile said the word had decided to be on our side for once. The weeks that followed were administrative and holy. Statements arrived like reluctant confessions. The amounts were not small. Each deposit to the trust felt like a stone placed in a foundation we had been building with our hands blistered and our hearts skeptical. My father sent a regular transfer with a note that said, "For what was always yours," and I let the words lay where they fell. The bride sent nothing more than silence and photographs of a honeymoon that looked like a brochure for forgetting. My mother sent a handwritten letter that talked about miscommunication and different values and Lily's sensitive nature. I filed it under no reply required. I was learning that some answers are traps that only work if you walk back into the room that hurt you. One evening in March, I drove Lily past the community college with the good art studio and the old oaks that shade the courtyard like the backs of patient hands. She looked at the windows and the rhythm of students who had decided on evening classes and said she liked the way the buildings didn't try to be pretty. They just were. We parked and walked the paths like we were trying on a future. Admissions was closed, but someone had left brochures in a rack by the door that smelled like pencil and rain. We took one and sat on a bench and read about courses and schedules and how many credits it takes to call yourself the thing you have already been doing in the quiet for years. On the drive home, she asked if I ever wished we had yelled more. I thought about it. I thought about nurses who tell you a thing with a hand on your shoulder and how you hear it forever, and nurses who shout a truth you forget when the door swings closed. I told her I didn't miss yelling. I missed time. She nodded like she'd suspected that answer and was willing to forgive it. That night, after she went to bed, my husband and I stood in the kitchen without turning on the main light. The under-cabinet glow made our mugs into small moons. He said that if the story were a play today would have been the act where the music swells and the audience finally breathes. I told him I don't care about the audience anymore. I care about the girl in the river who learned to count stones and names them one by one without apologizing for the sound they make when they hit the bottom of her pocket. He kissed my forehead and said, "Then let's teach her to skip them across water when she wants to." I pictured the arcs those stones would make. I pictured the circles those arcs would leave behind not as targets, but as proof. Spring arrived, like a cautious guest standing on the porch with a handful of crocuses, waiting to see if the house would let her in. The snowmelt tricked the river into talking louder than it had in months. On a morning that smelled faintly of damp earth and pencil shavings, an email landed in my inbox with a subject line that made me sit down before I clicked it. Legacy Exhibit Youth Arts Invitation. The community college with the Patient Oaks was hosting a juried show for local high school artists. The theme was What We Carry. The coordinator had seen Lily's sketchbook on Instagram, a feed she kept private, except for one post her art teacher had shared with permission, a quick video of the diptych the river girl and the riverbed tilting in the kitchen light. We would be honored to include these, the coordinator wrote, if the artist is willing. I read it twice. I called Lily in from the porch where she'd been trying to coax the dog into believing in sunshine. She read it once and pressed her lips together like she didn't want to spook the moment. "I'm willing," she said, "if I can print the titles the way I want." The days between the invitation and the exhibit fell into a rhythm that felt like music we had always known but never learned to dance to. We framed the diptych with simple wood that looked like it had kept its promises. We practiced hanging and rehanging on the living room wall until the spacing honored the quiet between images. We drafted the artist statement, Lily's words, my commas about River's inventory, and how before is a place you can stand if you have to, but after is where you learn your own name. She wanted to sign it Lily Daughter, and I watched her write the letters like she was shaking hands with the world. In the middle of this, the court's 30-day clock ran out. Statements had arrived and funds moved as ordered, not with contrition, but with the mechanical obedience of something compelled. The trust's balance turned from numbers that made me ache to numbers that made me breathe. My father kept sending notes with his transfers, brief, unadorned, a man deciding that if he could not rewrite the story, he could at least add punctuation that told the truth. My mother sent a message to Ms. Harper asking for mediation dates, and one to me about putting the past behind us for the sake of appearances at public events. I forwarded the first to Ms. Harper and ignored the second. It wasn't mutiny. It was a refusal to audition for a role I had never wanted. The exhibit opened on a Friday evening that blushed toward warm. The gallery smelled like varnish and dust, and the particular electricity of people deciding together to notice. Lily wore a navy dress with pockets and a pair of boots that made her look more grounded than any floor. She carried the two titles in a neat envelope. Before, beneath the sketch of the judge's hovering pen, and inventory beneath the riverbed, hands full of stones. We arrived early because courage likes an empty room first, to hear how our feet sound against the floor. The coordinator, a woman near my age with silver at her temples, greeted Lily by her name, as if she'd been expecting her since last year. She set a small tin of pins on the table and asked if Lily wanted one that said artist in block letters. Lily laughed and pinned it to her dress as if she'd been born with that word, and only just now remembered where to put it. 10 minutes before the doors opened, my father walked in wearing the sweater that had finally become what I intended when I knit it: warmth, not apology. He hugged Lily, then me, and stood with his hands in his pockets like a man practicing being present. The dog was home with my husband. We had left the back porch light on a small lighthouse for a ship at anchor. I was about to turn to the wall labels when the temperature of the room changed the way it does when a door opens and lets in weather. My mother stepped in, my sister behind her in a coat that still believed it was a wedding dress. They looked at the space with that brand of appraisal that makes even art feel like a seating chart. I felt my back straighten by a reflex older than my boundary, and then I felt something else. Lily's fingers land on the inside of my elbows, steady, like I was the one learning how to walk a narrow path without looking down. They approached the movement of people who think the room is waiting for them to decide what it means. My mother smiled the way a blade flashes quick and bright. She complimented the frames and the lighting, and then, as if it were a reasonable request, asked if Lily had considered simplifying the titles to avoid inviting questions. My sister's gaze bounced off the canvases and landed on the pin on Lily's dress, and she laughed a high, brittle laugh that people use to test a room's allegiance. I did not make a speech. I did not rehearse the language of courtrooms or Christmases or cedar chests. I stepped slightly to the side, the way you do to allow someone to be seen, and I let Lily answer her own life. I want questions. Lily said, not defiant, not performative, just true. Questions are how people learn not to repeat things that break other people. She looked past them to the canvases, as if reminding them that the work existed even when they looked away. My mother's mouth tightened. She said something about family matters and not airing laundry. The coordinator, who had been adjusting a spotlight 2 walls over, drifted closer with the sort of curiosity that sees through varnish to wood. She asked Lily if she wanted to place the titles now. Lily nodded and walked to the wall, with slow, ordinary steps, the kind of movement that insists it's right to be unremarkable even as the air hums. She slid, before into its little holder and pressed it flat with her thumb. She slid inventory into the other and smoothed it once, twice the way you smooth a sheet on a bed you made for someone you love. The gallery doors opened. People came in. The room decided what kind of room it would be. I watched it happen, not a fireworks moment, not a gavel, but a collection of small recognitions landing where they belong. Teenagers clustered in front of the diptych, pointing in that tender way teenagers do when they want to be careful with someone else's brave thing. A man with paint under his nails stood back, and then forward, and then back again, a private dance with understanding. A teacher I didn't know whispered to the coordinator that she wanted to show her freshman class how titles can redeem a frame. My mother hovered a polite distance, adjusting her scarf like it could tighten a story. My sister scrolled on her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone committed to not noticing. And then a girl 16 maybe, with hair dyed the color of a promise you make to yourself, stopped in front of inventory and began to cry. Not loud, not theatrical, just the unguarded tears of a person who has found a mirror that doesn't lie. Lily saw her and went over. They stood together, 2 figures in front of hands that held stones. And if this story had a single moment that taught me the actual sound forgiveness makes, when it visits, it was that the good hush of 2 young women discovering they did not have to beg for a seat to be offered one that had always been theirs. The coordinator asked if Lily would say a few words. She didn't have to. The work was talking. But she stood anyway in front of the river girl and the riverbed, and she thanked everyone for coming, and then said I made these because I was tired of being a question in someone else's picture. She didn't look at anyone in particular when she added, I'm not an exception. I'm a name. The applause was not thunderous. It was kind. The kind you hear when a boat docks where it was supposed to dock all along. When the crowd thinned, my mother approached me with a look I recognized from countless holidays, the expression of a woman about to draft the world into her version of mercy. She said she was willing to move forward if I would stop making scenes. I thought of the courtroom and the email chain and the geese-printed tin and the way Lily's hand had steadied my arm earlier. I kept my voice in the register that never lies. You made the scene I said. We built an exit. She opened her mouth to argue with the verb, and then closed it when she realized the grammar would not forgive her. She left without saying goodbye to her granddaughter. My sister went with her, the friction of their coats loud in the quiet they couldn't control. We stayed. We helped take down the titles at the end of the night, as if we were lifting something precious back into the box. It came in not to hide it, but to transport it carefully to the next room. Outside, the oaks held the last of the light in their hands, and the evening lifted its cool shoulder. My father hugged us at the curb and said, "First pancakes on me tomorrow," and it sounded like a vow not to be late again. At home, we leaned the diptych against the living room wall and sat on the rug like campers around a small fire. My husband fetched cocoa, and the dog curled into Lily's boots like a satisfied comma. The trust paperwork waited on the coffee table, not ominous now, just steadfast. Lily traced the wood grain on the floor with her toe and asked if revenge always feels like this. I asked what this felt like. She thought and said, like we turned a lock but we didn't slam the door. I told her revenge, when it's worth anything, is just restoration wearing work boots. The real satisfaction isn't that they hurt, it's that we don't anymore. She nodded, the shape of understanding settling into her face, like dawn knows where to put itself on a window. Later, alone with the sink light and the hush that comes after rooms have tasted joy, I took out the letter from Aunt May and read it again. You can tell when a child has decided to belong, she wrote. She will make the ground remember her. I thought about the courtroom's carpet and the gallery's polished concrete and my own kitchen floor, and how each in its own way had memorized our feet. I thought about my mother, a woman who loved appearance more than presence, and I let the ache come and go without trying to edit it. There are losses you count like coins, and losses you count like stars, not to total them, but to remember you looked up. I rinsed our mugs and opened the window. Night air moved through the screen with the quiet confidence of something that has never asked anyone's permission to be itself. If I were to tell you what I learned now that the riverbed is visible and our pockets are heavy with kept promises, I would say this: boundaries are not walls. They are doors that swing on the oiled hinge of self-respect. Secrets ferment in cedar boxes until someone brave enough names the smell. Family is a word that can be weapon or weather, depending on who's holding it. And love, the kind that shows up with folders and cocoa and a seat at the gallery wall, is the only kind of revenge that leaves everyone who matters more whole than before. I am a woman 39, a mother who thought belonging was something you plead for until I remembered it is something you build. I am still building. My daughter is too. We have stones in our pockets not for throwing, but for skipping into the future, each circle widening until even the shore realizes it has a new shape. If this story found you at the edge of your own river, let it be a hand you take while you step. If it found you inside a room where policy is a curtain, let it be the breeze that lifts it. If you are the one who underlined someone else's future and wrote, "We'll decide," let it be the mirror that teaches you how to return what was never yours. And if you are a girl who has ever been called the girl, like a placeholder, in a sentence that refuses to learn your name, take this as proof that the ground will remember you when you tell it to. If this journey moved you, stay with me. Like this video, so it reaches someone standing at their own before. Share it with the person who needs proof that restoration can be gentle and fierce at once. Subscribe, and come back for the stories we'll keep unspooling, the ones where doors open, names are spoken, and family learns to be a verb. Leave me a comment about the stone you're choosing to carry, and the one you're finally willing to put down.